his crew's out at sea right now, and he's probably going to be hanging out in his blockhouse smoking his pipe. So what we're going to do is we're all going to get together, and we're going to sneak up there tonight, and we're going to grab him, and we're going to make him tell us where that bottle is.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander F., and today we are so excited to talk about witch bottles on Glitch Bottle with author and scholar Dan Harms. Okay, so what is a witch bottle exactly? And why are witch bottles these powerful magical counter-offensives against antagonistic magic? What are the stunning ingredients found in a witch bottle itself, and how do you actually use it? Well, Dan Harms is the best person to ask as he returns on the podcast to discuss his latest tome, Witch Bottles: History, Culture, Magic. Dan is a librarian and author living in central New York. He has a master's in anthropology from the University at Buffalo and a master's in library and information science from the University of Pittsburgh. His fascination with magical belief and practice has led Dan to research and publish a great deal in the areas of folklore, ritual magic, and their appearances in literature. In addition to the constellation of other books, research, and blog posts, I know that so many listeners are familiar with Dan's presentation of the Book of Oberon, a source book of Elizabethan magic, presented along with Joseph H. Peterson and the illustrator James R. Clark, which was a defining text of English-based ceremonial magic, drawing from and refining or adding to other grimoire sources in the previous centuries. In this episode, Dan returns to talk about witch bottles in Europe and America from hundreds of years ago, the trial records and physical specimens that he documents, and the future of these fascinating items used for defense and counter-attack. Also, a huge thank you to each and every Glitch Bottle patron at patreon.com/glitchbottle for your amazing questions for Dan. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome back Dan Harms. Dan Harms, thank you so much for stopping back on the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Glitch bottles on Witch Bottle? How could I resist, right?
I was going to say that, but I restrained myself. You said it, so I don't have to. So we're all good.
I am always happy to take the lower road, Dan. Absolutely. Dan, the best place to start here is the genesis of witch bottles. You share in the book that it started out as a reproduction of a 19th century grimoire from cunning man William Dawson Bell House. What made you decide to not only update witch bottles, but to re-release it as its own book?
So let's give some history here about this whole project, which is that I found in the New York Public Library a book by a Liverpool cunning man named William Dawson Bell House dating to 1852. And when we think about 19th century cunning folk, we have a good number of accounts, but not so much in terms of surviving manuscripts, unless you're thinking about the Denley and Hockley, manuscripts those guys are putting together. So I said, hey, this is probably worth publishing. I ran this past Ben Fernie at Caduceus, and Ben decided that he wanted to do this with a slipcase that had a secret compartment in it. And there's only one answer when someone says, hey, I want to put your book in a slipcase with a secret compartment. And so that's what started it. But, you want to make sure the secret compartment is big enough. I don't know if this is actually the thought process that went through his head, but this is what I'm interpreting it as. So he was like, okay, so we're going to publish the Cunning Man's Manual. We're going to publish like a biographical work about the Cunning Man. This is so many pages. Well, what if we put in another couple extra books for people? What about a book about witch bottles? And what about a book about wax images? So I thought about like, you know what? Those would be some nice condensed small projects. They're not spending years transcribing a massive Elizabethan or Jacobean tome of magic. Yeah, I think I can do this. So I wrote these two small books. And this was, released by Caduceus in this lovely slipcase set with a secret compartment. And of course, you can't buy this anymore. So I'm sorry about that. It's out there on the market for, extreme amounts of money. But I then revisited it because I was saying, I put some work into this. We had a really cool book that we created, and now I want to see what the next phase is with it. So Bell House, hopefully we'll see print at some point, but he's also very, very, it's got a little bit more specialized audience that might be interested in that. Wax Images, I felt as a book was something that probably needs more work. And the Witch Bottle book, though, had a couple things going for it. One, it was very condensed. It's possible if you try, and have the resources of a good library to kind of pull together just about everything that's been published on witch bottles. And there's nothing else out there like it. There is no other book on witch bottles. I think later on, I saw one question from someone, which was, hey, where should I go if I want to read more about witch bottles? And unfortunately, the answer is I don't have a good answer at this point, to be honest, because no one else has written a book that's been, published for a wide audience on this particular topic. You'll get little threads here and there. There's some archaeological reports. There may be some blog reports or maybe some videos of people opening witch bottles. There may be some accounts in various, pamphlets or trial records. But to go down any one of those, routes, you're just going to find a little piece of the whole. So what I wanted to do with the Witch Bottle book was to basically take this material, condense it all together and tell people, okay, this is where you can start. And I'm going to make sure that it's as complete as I can make it. I'm going to cover as best I can archaeological evidence and historical documents and actual incantations and all of these things, and just kind of put them together in one source and, make sure I've got a detailed bibliography for those who love a detailed bibliography, and those who don't like that can skip it. But just kind of have this all in one place. And I thought that was something that was very much needed at that point.
One of the many things that blew my mind going through your Witch Bottles book is the fact that you shared with me for the first time reading it that this is something that is constantly, this entire field is constantly being updated and changing, and there's new discoveries. Like, this is definitely would you say it's a living field that has this dynamism to it?
Well, it has a living field in two different manners, which is one that modern people want to make their own witch bottles. And the other one is that we discover witch bottles. And I think as more people are becoming aware of this as a phenomenon, yes, you found a bottle in your house. No, don't dump it out on the ground. No, don't drink it. This could be something that's a valuable piece of history. Maybe you should talk to, an archaeologist about it and see if you can find out some more. So I think it's expanding in different directions all at once, which is an interesting sort of field to be investigating and playing with.
Dan, to that exact point, I know myself and the listeners who might not be too familiar with witch bottles yet are wondering, okay, what the heck is a witch bottle? And in the book, Dan, you give your own scholarly and personal definition of a witch bottle, and you delineate what a witch bottle is, what a witch bottle is not. You go all the way back to, I believe it's 300 BC in Athens, and you kind of go through history. What is a witch bottle, and what are the characteristics that make something a witch bottle?
Well, I'm going to quote to you from my own book, because otherwise I want to make sure I get this right. I define it here in the early on as a ritual assemblage usually intended to fight off maleficent magic that employs at least two of the following three ingredients: a bottle, urine, and sharp objects, which may include needles, pins, or thorns. So it is for a particular purpose, as you can tell there, which is warding off harmful magic, or what people in the past would have called witchcraft. And it's also got those three ingredients, of which I'm taking two, because it's very difficult. Because, for example, you'll find a witch bottle, let's say, in an archaeological assemblage, but any liquid inside is gone, and you just have like a bottle with a bunch of nails inside, or thorns inside, or other objects inside. That allows me to kind of take that and compare it to something, a Victorian account where maybe you have a bottle and maybe you have some sort of liquid in it, but it doesn't get to any other details. So that's why I kind of made the 2 out of 3 distinction there. Of course, this also means that if you go far enough back in time, you get to this problematic category where there's no actual bottle involved. And so you end up with people who are basically cooking urine and pins in a pan, maybe while saying an incantation. And that in itself is an anti-witchcraft charm. And that, as I said, doesn't have a bottle, and it doesn't leave any trace on the archaeological record. But I think it is a sort of an important precursor to the witch bottles themselves.
And also, you mentioned, too, in your book that, quote, 1/10 of the bottles reported by 2004 included a cloth heart, and that, quote, if the 16th century examples are any indication, animal hearts were the original ingredients, with the cloth hearts being substituted later, unquote. Can you just share about this kind of fourth ingredient in some of the bottles and the importance of using hearts or cloth hearts?
I think you've summed it up fairly well, that we do early on see animal hearts, possibly with, sharp objects driven into them, placed in the bottles to begin with, starting out with animal hearts, later on cloth hearts, possibly because if you have a bottle, it's easier to get a cloth heart in there because you can wad it up a bit than an animal heart. Now, what exactly this means, I don't know. This is kind of the theme that surrounds a lot of witch bottles, because we don't have a lot of records in which people say, I'm putting together a witch bottle based on these principles. We do get, incantations, but these are largely, what has survived is largely in terms of like recipe books. Nobody tells you why to bake a cake or, what the principles are behind baking a cake in a cookbook. You're putting together a cake, right? So I can't really speak too much to, the purpose behind it. There's some obvious, ideas there, which is that, okay, someone is trying to put some hostile magic on another person. Well, you just kind of draw a heart and you put, needles into it. And that's kind of an expression of one's intent. And there's a bit of sympathetic magic there. And that might be helping to direct it back. However, there is also another way of viewing witch bottles, which sees them as the bottle itself as a bladder, as a person's bladder. And there are also cases where people say explicitly, the witch bottle is intended to put pressure on the person's bladder and then make them extremely uncomfortable that way, and then cause them to reverse the magic. So you've got 2 different theories here. Maybe different ones are at play at different times. Maybe some people had no theory in mind and just said, okay, this is what we're supposed to do if this happens, right? There is just so much we don't know about the witch bottles, and hopefully someday someone will have written a letter saying exactly, or another document saying exactly, this is what we meant to do when we put together a witch bottle. But for now, we're speculating a bit.
The mist of speculation has been blissfully lifted thanks to your scholarship and your own research, Dan, because in this book, and I know listeners, you will thoroughly enjoy this, not only with the examples that Dan gives, but also you provide and share with readers, Dan, written instructions for constructing witch bottles, as you just touched on. You also look at witch trial accounts, actual records of witch trials, and also you look at the records of folklorists and antiquarians as well. So when I think about you and Joseph H. Peterson and, Dr. Stephen Skinner and David Rankin and these, amazing scholars such as yourself, I always imagine in my 6-year-old brain of you like in the basement of the Vatican being guided by a paid off priest, and given access and smuggling a Necronomicon-like, tome in your arms through the musty catacombs. Can you just share with us a little bit about what does it take to actually scour the records, look at the accounts, the witch trial records?
A great deal of this is, well, some of it's happenstance. Some of it, I wrote this book because I originally found an incantation, actually 2 incantations in Bell House's personal manual that were for the creation of witch bottles. Maybe I can read one of those later. That might be fun. But then I started to look around and see what I could find out. I was finding some archaeological reports and some other articles people had written on the topic. And so you just start working your way back through those and saying, okay, well, I see that you've quoted from this source. All right, let me see if I can get that. And a lot of this is, to be honest, quite repetitive after a certain point, because it's, we found the Bellarmine bottle or Bartman bottle, it's 17th century in, southeastern England. And then you get into the details about that. But I think that every single piece of that is, crucially important in terms of trying to build up the picture. So it was just a matter of going out and doing searches. And also while I was at it, I was also reading, some other documents about magic, as people who read my blog know. And so I just try to keep this sort of material on sort of a churn. So every so often something else will turn up. I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to probably follow this link back. And that was actually particularly useful for this book, because I was actually able to find a couple of trial cases in Scandinavia in which they are using witch bottles. It's a very late period. This is our 19th century. But I looked at those reports and I said, okay, this was worth it. And this is something that's worth talking about, because normally witch bottles are seen as a phenomenon of the British Isles and also of the colonists who came out of that region. But it seems that the procedure had traveled somewhat, at least by the 19th century.
You must include in your book, I mean, gosh, if I had to guess, 50 or 60 different, either a short snippet or a short incantation or a really long historical record or an account or a documentation of the use of a witch bottle or something that almost meets the definition of a witch bottle. And so given all of these historical accounts, are there any accounts that you could share about with the listeners, or anything that comes to mind that you think listeners might enjoy?
I think I have one picked out. It is, there's an account by William Bottrell, who is a Cornish raconteur and a folklorist who collected a great deal of material in the late 19th century. And he told the tale set in Zennor. So those of you who know a little bit about Cornwall may have heard that there's a church where supposedly a mermaid came out of the ocean and sang in the choir to entice a young man away to live with her in the depths. This is that village, but that part of it doesn't come into this story. But what has happened is that there's a local landowner named Captain Matthew, and Captain Matthew has a great deal of land. He's got cows, he's got goats, he's got crops. But really what he's interested in is two things: treasure hunting and smuggling. So he's got a bunch of his crew. They come out of Lugen, which is actually where my family comes from. And so, they're running goods off the coast, and he'll get visions and dreams where he sees a treasure and they'll go try to find it. And at the same time, he's not fixing the fences, and he's not really taking care of the livestock. So the cattle and the goats are just kind of wandering all over the place and eating people's gardens and things like that. And it's not very good. One day he notices that his animals don't seem all that healthy, and that he's not feeling so good himself. So he goes a little ways away, west on the coast, to a little town called Treen. And there on the coast, supposedly, is a woman named Anne Maggie, who has basically just lives on the beach in this lean-to with a bunch of animals. And she wears like a wedding dress sometimes. Another time she wears men's clothing. And then she will, do target practice with her pistols and all sorts of things. She's just having a great time. But she's also known as the local wise woman. And so he comes in and talks to her and tells her the condition. And she says, well, maybe what you really need to be doing is fixing the fences so you're not making people angry so they don't cast hostile magic at you. And he's like, yeah, whatever. Just give me something that'll fix this. So he takes the urine from his livestock and he puts it in a bottle. And he's got like a little bunkhouse where all of his crew sleep at night. So he decides to take it out there and bury it under a big pile of tin behind it. So he's like, okay, well, let's see if this takes care of it. So this becomes known that he's done this, and maybe that's psychosomatic, or maybe there's some power in this. But people start getting sick in Zennor. In fact, over half the town is getting sick because nobody likes this guy. And everybody knows like a thing or two that they can use if they don't like somebody. And so they decide, okay, well, he's got this bottle here. We got to do something about this. Let's go talk to him about it. So they go and say, we are miserable. Can you please do something about the bottle? And his answer is, no, you're just stuck with all this. Then they go back home and they say, all right, here's what we're going to do. His crew's out at sea right now. And he's probably going to be hanging out in his blockhouse smoking his pipe. So what we're going to do is we're all going to get together and we're going to sneak up there tonight and we're going to grab him and we're going to make him tell us where that bottle is. They put this plan in place, but what they don't realize is all the Legion crew is there. And one of them's going outside and, to answer the call of nature, looks around, sees like this crowd of people slowly quietly making their way down there. And he's like, okay, I'm going to go back inside. And then everybody gets ready and they, load up their pistols and then they just wait. And then the first one kind of comes in the door because the door is low and the person has to lower their head to get in. And then they just smack them on the head with a big piece of wood. And then the next person comes in and they do the same. And then they've got their pistols are loaded with a very light sort of shot. So they start firing in the air and they start basically, I guess the equivalent of firing rock salt at people. And everybody's running away and they run back to the village and they get their guns and they come back. And now there's going to be a serious problem. But then the local parson shows up and sees all of this going on and asks what they're all doing. And then they all have to kind of confess, like, yeah, this is what's going on. He has to say, okay, Captain Matthew, you got to fix your fences. Now give him the bottle. And so he just gives him the bottle, and that's the end of the story. It's wonderful, and it's Cornish, and it involves a cross-dressing woman who is just firing pistols. So
I mean, wonderful. As you say, the different characters involved, the kind of the back and forth, and then the conclusion of like, okay, just tell him where the bottle is. Fix the fences. Like that's just, how are witch bottles a counter offensive against attacks by another person, usually someone who's suspected to be a witch? Can you just share about, how are they counter offensive? And then also how, in many cases, something that surprised me, the actual witch or the target would actually come banging on the door of the person who is using the witch bottle. So anything you can share with that?
So once again, we're getting to the area where we don't know quite what the theoretical underpinnings of all this is. But the idea behind the witch bottle, they seem to have been created for two purposes. One of which was for general protection, which is where they are left in a house. Maybe it's at the hearth, maybe it's at the door. Those are usually two, common places for magic. But they're left in one of those two places, and that seems to have some sort of protective function. This is an area where, we don't know a whole lot because people didn't talk about things left in the walls of their houses, which is kind of like there's a whole sort of group of archaeologists who are looking at these sort of, deposits in the walls of houses, and they're trying to figure out what exactly they are. And there's not a lot of literature on any of these. These are like the same things like, people leaving caps in the walls of their houses or shoes in the walls of their houses. And we don't know, kind of what the thought process was or if there was a ritual involved or something like that. The other thing that could be done was to deal with a particular case of witchcraft. This would usually be somebody who had fallen ill, maybe somebody who had seen some sort of regular medical practitioner of one sort or another, and they was not getting a solution to their problem, seemed to be getting more sick. And what would happen then is the bottle would be created. They would take the urine of the person, they would take the sharp objects, and they would put it in the bottle, and then they would place that in the fire. And the idea seems to have been that as the material in the fire heated up, as the liquid boiled, then that would put pressure on the witch to appear and ask for this to be countered or for them to take the bottle off the fire. It also seems to be the case that people would sometimes believe that if the bottle itself exploded, then that would be the death of the witch. Conversely, if the bottle's cork came out and popped around the room, well, then you'd probably have to go back and do it again. There was actually an interesting case, I think in Connecticut, where there was actually a problem with a poltergeist phenomena where, objects are flying around this house. And in this case, stones. And so they decide that this was the place they wanted to do the witch bottle ritual. And there's an obvious outcome of this. If you're putting a bottle on the fire and there's stones flying through the air, well, that bottle's not going to last for too long. So that doesn't seem to have done them a lot of good. But that seems to have been the thought behind it. As the bottle was boiling, the person would show up in many cases. Sometimes the people would relent and, release the bottle if the person promised to stop doing what they were doing. In other cases, they could be just silent and not talk to the person and just let them come to whatever fate they may.
To that very point, Dan, we have a listener question for you from Glitch Bottle patron Richard Irving, who is asking and saying, quote, "Hi, Daniel, I love your book. Interestingly, with these bottles, you share that when used successfully, they would actually draw the witch, usually in pain or discomfort, to the house of the person who is defending themselves. Is this similar," Richard is asking, Dan, to how the famous voodoo dolls have been used to inflict harm or change on someone? Thank you.
Well, I have a few thoughts here. First of all, let's deal with the concept of voodoo dolls, because voodoo dolls are actually the idea of a doll that which you make of somebody, and then you poke some pins into, make them, compel them to do something, or to sometimes I think help them out. This is not something that actually comes from sub-Saharan African traditions. This is something that was found in the Fertile Crescent, in the Mediterranean, and Europe for thousands of years. So I just want to make sure that everyone's aware of that. So it is to some extent similar. We have some sort of potential modeling of the human body, at least in part. If we are using the heart hypothesis or the bladder hypothesis, that this is what some component of the ritual does. So that's kind of like making a figure of somebody. I think the key difference with the witch bottle, and this is the twist, is that I can't think of a witch bottle example in which a person is named over the witch bottle. Maybe some of the later 19th century stuff, which is about love magic and is kind of weird. But for the most part, that part is completely silent. And this is with a lot of magic, with, say, these poppets, you might want to have part of the person that you're trying to affect in them, maybe a piece of hair or something like that, maybe fingernails, or you might want to know the name of the person involved. Whereas with regard to the witch bottle, it seems to be focused on, this is not articulated anywhere, mind you. So this is something that I'm trying to extrapolate, following the trail of the magic back to its source. Whatever hostile magic it is, it's following right back along that, back to the source. So it's not you're not saying, well, I'm going to target this person over here, but that person wasn't the problem. And then now you've done witchcraft on them, right? So in this case, it's a little bit more safe in a way, is that if nobody's affecting you and you put together a witch bottle and, put it on the fire, well, it's not going to hurt anybody. But if there is somebody out there, you don't have to know who it is. It's just going to go right back to them, and it's going to cause them some problems.
We have a listener question for you from Megan Rashid. And Megan is saying and asking, could you ask Mr. Harms about why ritualistic silence is very important when someone is using a witch bottle as a defense against a malevolent attack from a witch? Thank you.
I think silence plays into a couple of different aspects here. One of which is that there are witch bottle recipes in which they are supposed to be conducted in silence, the creation of the bottle or some aspect of it. And I think that language is something that's very important in magic, but how it plays out can be different in different circumstances. Sometimes it's very much about the incantation, but sometimes it's also about the obverse. The silence can kind of set what you're doing apart from the world. It can also kind of break the ties that exist between us and the human world, where we are people and we talk to each other and we share how things are going and we give each other a hard time, or we try to support each other. All these things you can do with language. And this is kind of saying, well, we're going to put that on hold for a moment and we're going to step away from that. Where it becomes more important in the witch bottle literature, though, is with regard to the person who shows up after the witch bottle has been placed on the fire. Because there is often an attempt in any sort of anti-witchcraft account of doing a ritual like this, of a person coming back and trying to get some sort of tie back to the person to sort of reassert that social bond. And that doesn't necessarily have to be silence. Sometimes it can be borrowing something. That's fairly common, borrowing a cup of sugar or something like that, or a tool, to thereby put the bond back together, recreate that bond that the counter witchcraft is breaking. And I think that that's kind of a broader sort of undercurrent when we think about how witchcraft accusations or counter witchcraft sort of charms actually work, is that, trying to keep from recreating that bond right now, because we still have a problem and you need to shape up. And once you do that, we will be more or less okay.
When I was reading your book, I'm like, okay, Dan's taking us from, Europe and North America to CSI. And to that point, you say in the book, quote, the first formal laboratory analysis of such a bottle, a witch bottle, was conducted in 2009, opening the door to further investigation of these artifacts and their creation, unquote. So, Dan, can you share a little bit about this analysis in 2009 and why was this analysis so important?
Well, I am slightly at a disadvantage on this one because this analysis has not actually been published, and I was not able to acquire it for the book. But the idea behind it was they found a Bartman jar, or a Bellarmine, which I should probably say, I've used this phrase before. These are 17th century bottles brought in from Germany to England, which have a man's bearded face on the neck of them. And they're stoneware, and the face is often said to be somebody named Cardinal Bellarmine, but doesn't actually seem to have been that. That seemed to be the motif they put on the bottle. And maybe that led people to use these as sort of symbolic people who are being affected by whatever spell you're casting, but maybe not. Once again, very much up in the air. So they find this bottle at Greenwich in 2004, and a Dr. Alan Massey of Loughborough University conducts a ongoing sequence of tests on it. First, an X-ray to explore the contents, then a CT scan to get a better sense of what's inside, looking at what's inside through mass spectrometry and other archaeological methods, even getting down to looking at the details of a woodlouse found within some of the material within the bottle. This is a late 17th century object, and most bottles have not undergone this level of scrutiny. Honestly, even from among archaeologists for a long time, the practice was, hey, I found a bottle. It's got some liquid in it. It's probably no good. And just, turn it upside down, dump it out, because now you got a bottle. And that's what you're here for. You're here to find, neat bottles. That would often kind of, first of all, get rid of any liquid inside. And second of all, would, dump out any sort of, if there was hair or pins or needles or anything like that, it may just fall out and all whatever gunk is in there, and then you've kind of lost the whole thing. So this is why this was sort of revolutionary, which is the analysis of a bottle that hasn't actually been opened yet, and being very systematic about it and being very careful about the contents.
You also share a little bit about witch trial records, and to that point, we have a listener question for you from Lydia Rembert, and Lydia is asking and saying, "Hi Daniel, my question is, were witch bottles discussed in the famous Salem witch trials in North America? Also, Lydia says, you mentioned, Dan, that witches were usually not convicted or punished for their use of witch bottles. Any context around these would be great. Thank you."
Well, the case of the Salem trials witch bottle was a charge directed at Martha Emerson, who was one of the people accused relatively late in the process. I'm not an expert on the Salem witch trials, but I do know that she was kind of brought in at the end of the witch trials. The rest of her family had already been accused, so they kind of assumed that probably she had also done something questionable. But during that trial, she did bring up how she had a procedure for making a bottle that would, injure a witch or kill a witch. And I don't know how exactly they concluded that this was such a problem that they need to bring her up at trial. Some of the charges at this point seemed particularly questionable even for the Salem witch trials with regard to Martha. So some of this seemed a little bit questionable even for the Salem witch trials. So eventually she was let go. More broadly, you don't really see people usually tried for witch bottles. at witch trials themselves. Now, I will say that in later periods, you will get people who are tried for fraud for using the witch bottles. That's a whole other situation. But people were not usually tried for using witch bottles to track down witches in terms of like, you're using magic now. And I think that the question of why it wasn't used is answered by the fact that a lot of people just weren't prosecuted for using this sort of magic of, of pretty much any sort. There were some very harsh laws on the books in England up until the repeal of the Witchcraft Acts. The beginning of the 18th century is when they really start to stop persecuting witches because it starts getting very embarrassing. They have some high profile witch trials that just don't work out. But really, if you're not doing something like trying to maim or kill someone, or you're hunting treasure, or you're conjuring evil spirits, or maybe you're getting stuff out of the graveyard, as was in the case of the Elizabethan and Jacobean Witchcraft Acts. If you're just trying to help out the community, a lot of times people are just not going to prosecute you because you've got a use. The same way that for a long time there was a conception that midwives were often, tried during witch trials. And I'm not going to say that they weren't, but it was often the case that they were seen as useful people in the community. They were performing a useful service. And so if you get rid of the midwife, well, then what are you going to do the next time you need to have someone come to your house and deliver a baby? You're going to get the physician to come 20 miles to do that in the middle of the night? That's no good. And I think a lot of the cunning people were seen in the same way, that they were being seen as, okay, well, we need to find out who stole our sheep, or I'm not feeling very well and I need to, maybe get some herbs, or, something seems to be off around the house, or, I'm feeling as if something is affecting me supernaturally. Maybe I need to get a protective amulet or something like that. And that's what the cunning people were there for. And so they had this valuable role in the community, and they especially had a valuable role when it came to witchcraft, because the ultimate remedy for witchcraft, according to a society that believes in the Bible, is, well, you kill the witch. But if you're a society that believes in the Bible, you also just can't have people going around and killing each other because they think that they're witches. And so what has evolved here is this whole other sequence of formal and informal ways of dealing with charges of witchcraft. Because you can also go to a trial, but that's also a lot of work. There were some people who got rich off of witch trials, but it was usually, I don't think, for the most part, not the community. It was actually very disruptive to local society and local business. So instead, these informal methods could be pursued. So yeah, if somebody puts a bottle on a fire and that solves a problem, sure, that's fine.
I'm doing this from memory, so forgive me if I mess this up, but you share about, regarding famous names in the Salem witch trials, Increase Mather, which talk about a cool name, and how there was an early writing that Increase Mather had regarding not being super tolerant, but just kind of saying, oh yes, this is a use of a witch bottle. And then a couple years later, I believe, or at least at a future account, it seems that Mather really got a lot more strict on, the suspicious use of these bottles too.
Yes. He and Cotton. Increase says it originally. I'll pull it up right now. How persons that shall unbewitch others by putting urine into a bottle or casting excrements, whatever that is, can wholly cure themselves from being white witches, I am not able to understand. And then 9 years later, he starts getting this whole thing where it's obviously invented by the devil so that innocent people will be accused of horrible things. So I'm not really sure what happened in between those two. This is another point. You've got a lot of literature about witch bottles, which is actually like polemic literature where people are saying, well, what kind of ridiculous thing are people doing now? And you know what? They go out in the countryside, and it's usually country people, because we have to kind of maintain this whole urban rural divide. So it's all those uneducated people off in the country who are doing these questionable things, and they go out there and they make this bottle and they say an incantation over it. But I'm not going to tell you what the incantation is. Damn. Just tell me the incantation. I can put it in a book. No. And it's all just ridiculous and nonsense. So they're part of this broader sort of invective against practitioners and the sort of things that they saw as being superstitious or impious or any other sort of, all sorts of other different labels that were kind of trying to push this sort of practice away from what people should properly do, which of course in a Protestant society is pray really, really long and hard about everything. Just do that. That'll solve it.
Many listeners, Dan, are familiar with the German grimoire, the sixth and seventh books of Moses, but also, again, this kind of American adaptation and how, these Pennsylvania Dutch Hexenmeisters or powwow masters was used. Can you share a little bit about, and I love how you lay this out in the book, about how witch bottles were used by the Pennsylvania Dutch in powwowing?
Yeah, sure. So we do see examples of these witch bottles in the powwowing manuals. And just, of course, to put the little gloss on that, powwowing is a German-American practice of folk medicine that does not actually have anything to do with Native Americans. This was just kind of a label they put on it to kind of give it sort of an exotic flavor. But it's also one that is very much used in the community today. So, yeah, they did use witch bottles. There is, to me, an open question about how they found out about witch bottles. Did they learn about this from their English-speaking neighbors? Or was this, some sort of example of a practice from Germany that we just don't have much of a sign of or no one has really looked for that came over and it was brought over to Pennsylvania? The interesting things about some of these recipes, I'd say, is that they sometimes have sharp objects and sometimes they don't. And they are also tend to be locked up with a key. So they're not being placed on a fire. They're not being placed in the hearth or under the doorstep. They're basically just being locked up someplace. That's supposed to be what puts the pressure on the witch to compel them to lift whatever hex they've placed.
Where do you think the field is going in the coming months and the coming years when it comes to witch bottles? And after listeners check out your book, where would you kind of point them to if they want to delve even more into this topic?
It's really hard to say. I think that a lot of this is going to be driven by discoveries that people make. There is one major, I'd say, work, hopefully coming, that will be published at some point soon, which is that the Museum of London Archaeology did this massive project for 3 years on witch bottles. Of course, they had the unfortunate luck to do this during the pandemic. So I'm not sure where exactly they are in terms of their timeline, but I understand that they're writing up a report, and that sort of systematic examination of the archaeological evidence, I think, is going to be something that's going to be very exciting to see.
Do you think that those patterns of more discovery and then also more people being interested in witch bottles will continue in the future?
I think absolutely, though there is a slight hesitation, I say, to whether people making witch bottles will continue, because apparently there's now a TikTok trend in which people look at witch bottles and say those are actually sour jars, which is a creation, I think, of Hoodoo and Conjure. If you know Hoodoo and Conjure and I got that wrong, please let me know. But the idea is that it has the same ingredients in terms of urine and maybe some sharp objects, but it's supposed to be something that affects somebody else. And I think that people like having rules for things, and I think that a lot of magic is a lot more like poetry than science. It's not about X plus Y plus Z has the same result. It's more about sort of associations and things like that. So I think it's fine to have sour jars and you have your witch bottles. But I think that the question is whether people will come to recognize witch bottles in modern practice, or we sort of like overwhelmed by, its comparison with this item from a different tradition, even though I think there are indeed witch bottles in Hoodoo that I mentioned in my book. I don't want to say 100% because I don't have that part in front of me, but I do believe it's in there. So I think that might be something that leads to, people not practicing as much. So we'll see how that goes in the future. But I think people in general are becoming more aware of them, and they're becoming more attuned to them, and they're keeping an eye out for them when they, do renovations on their houses or their local buildings. That will hopefully lead to the recovery of more witch bottles, and hopefully not lead to them placing the witch bottles on eBay, so where someone will buy them and we'll never see them again. there's probably going to be a number of discoveries that are going to happen, and I'm hoping we get some that are actually going to show us some new variations on it, or maybe it would be really great to get some sort of description of the processes involved in the creation of the witch bottle and what the people were thinking about, what they were doing, an expression of that sort of mentality and what they were trying to put together as they were assembling one. That would be really great, but I'm not too optimistic about that.
Well, and Dan, that really underlines for me just the importance of your own book, because as you say, it's really the first examination exclusively of witch bottles, really delving into the history and over 400, 500, 600 years more, even all the way back to 300 BC in Athens with prototypes of witch bottles. What are some of the biggest misconceptions that people might have about witch bottles that maybe we haven't touched on in this conversation? And what other tips would you want people just to keep in mind as they read your book or maybe go looking for witch bottles of their own?
Well, first, I'd like to really quickly address the 300 BC piece, which is the object which is described in the book, which I actually do not consider witch bottle precursor. What this is, for those who haven't read my book, is it's a pot with a large doornail placed through it. And I think some remains of chicken head and bones, like the parts you don't actually want to eat, that was placed under this workshop. And it has names written in it. And I think this was something that my publisher actually asked me about. Like, okay, do you think this is a witch bottle? And I had to say, I actually don't think so. And one of the key components there is, first of all, that you have an object that's being pierced, right? So it's not the container. It's not being contained. It's now got a hole in it. And the other aspect is that it has the names written around inside it, which seem to be the names of a good number of people who the person who put it in there wanted to affect in some way. So we're thinking this is probably some sort of political magic. I'm not thinking that is necessarily a witch bottle. So I just want to make that clear. But I did want to make sure that if people saw something like that, it was a good thing to talk about, because I think could then sort of work off that and say, okay, if this isn't a witch bottle, then what is? And how do we work our way back to that? With regard to misconceptions about witch bottles and things people should keep in mind, there's just so much we don't know. And anyone who tells you that they have, a definitive idea of what's going on with this vast phenomena, which involves so many different bottles in so many different places and so many, like a huge range of contents, which we haven't even gotten into here, that person is probably, maybe leading you a little bit astray, because I have looked at as much as I can about witch bottles, and I don't have an answer to a lot of the questions about them. Also, the other thing to think about is that we are often misled sometimes in terms of what should be in a witch bottle. There does seem to be a push away from, putting urine in a bottle for some reason. Not sure why people are reluctant to do that. And also to kind of move it to more herbal ingredients and nice things like, rosemary. Put some rosemary in there. I'm not going to tell you not to put rosemary in your rose bottle. I will tell you that I have yet to run into an example of a non-modern witch bottle that had rosemary in it. So like rosemary is kind of like my touchstone. If I read something, I'm like, okay, I know where this one's coming from. Whether they're trying to recreate a folk practice or whether they're just kind of putting together something of their own. Not to reject either one of those approaches, but it's just something to watch for. That people are trying to create these variations, and they're trying to come up with their own innovations, and all of this is part of how magic works and how magic is passed on and transforms through time.
Would it be safe to say, Dan, that another tip, if listeners are out there and maybe they do eventually find a potential witch bottle in the walls of a house or construction site, wherever it is, would it be safe to say, at least from your book, one of the big lessons I got is don't just immediately open the bottle and dump all the contents out on the ground? Would that be fair?
So let's see. Don't open it up. Definitely don't dump it out. Don't drink it.
Yes.
I think this happened on Antique Roadshow. Somebody drank one. I don't think that actually got into the book. But no, don't drink it.
Oh, wow.
Contact archaeologists, your local archaeological museum or an archaeology department at a university, and see if they're interested. I also think the Museum of London Archaeology was collecting and probably still is collecting reports of these and trying to compile them together. So yes, do all that. Don't give in to the temptation to sell it on eBay. It would be best if these were in a museum, or if barring that, maybe if you just kind of put it back in the house as as part of the history of the place after someone has looked at it. That's what I would say if you found people should do if they find a witch bottle, which is, I think it's unlikely to happen unless you're in the UK, but I don't want to necessarily say that it's not going to happen if you're in the States or Europe. In fact, if you find something that you think is a witch bottle there, it might actually be more important. Just talk to your local archaeologist. I think they're generally happy when people can bring them something that's new and intriguing and interesting.
Dan, I understand that there is something out right now in addition to all the other projects that you have out. Can you share with us about this latest project that you have?
Yes. So it is sort of a follow-up to the Book of Oberon. It is the Book of Four Occult Philosophers from Llewellyn with S. Alderney, who has done some amazing illustrations. And what this is a book that I found in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. It is a manuscript that's probably about 400 pages long. And what happened is you had somebody in the late 17th century write the original, and then you had someone in the late 18th century write more material around it and add on some pages to kind of put this in some sort of context and make it more respectable by their standards, but also inserts a bunch of notes and other charms into the margins and at the beginning, at the end. And then you get Olivia Serres, who was known as Princess Olive and was a pretender as the Duchess of Cumberland. She puts her own material in this. And then we have Raphael. Yes, the Raphael astrologer, the first one, also has material in the book. And it is just this amazing sort of compilation of all sorts of spells and charms and astrological data and things I don't even know what to do with. There's like an illustration that might be something significant or might be something that a little kid drew. I don't know, but it's in the book. And I hope someone will tell me someday what it actually is, because I'm really interested in presenting all of these little puzzles to people so that they can come back to me and tell me, hey, Dan, I think I figured out what that was. Or, hey, Dan, you were completely wrong about that. So you've got over 600 pages of this. It's thicker than Oberon, and it is just an amazing work. And I'm so happy to be able to present this to all of you.
Listeners, check out the podcast and video descriptions below as well for the Book of Four Occult Philosophers from Llewellyn. That sounds absolutely fascinating. I cannot wait to delve the esoteric spade deep into that. You are constantly working on something. Can you give us some hints or maybe a little teaser in terms of what upcoming projects are you working on, maybe new writings, or just what ideas are you thinking about, esoterically or otherwise, that you'd like to share with listeners?
Well, a great deal of my effort is going into otherwise these days, because I am revising the Cthulhu Mythos Encyclopedia for its 4th edition to make it into a even more massive, amazing, wonderful reference for people who are interested in Lovecraft and the Cthulhu mythos. That does not mean I have deserted the field of magic. Another thing that I'm working on right now is a paper dealing with that ritual in the Grimorum Verum, where you have like a skull and you plant seeds in it, and then they grow, and you take one and they sprout these beans, and you put one in your mouth and you become invisible. I am dealing with all the examples of that, and I had a paper presented at a conference which was well received, and now I'm trying to work it into something a little bit more, because this goes beyond France, and it goes beyond the time of the 18th and 19th century sort of fluorescence of French grimoires. There are examples throughout Western Europe and Northern Europe. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to compile all that together and see if that gives me something. At least I can say that what I love to do in a lot of cases with magic is say, hey, you know that weird ritual that everybody just looked at and said, boy, that's really weird. Well, there's a lot of examples of that. And I don't know if that says something fundamental about the human condition. And I think given the span in terms of space and time that this one would cover, trying to say something about the human condition through it would be sort of a folly, but it at least shows the transmission of these ideas and how popular they were, and how different people use them in different contexts.
I think it's fair to say that you are certainly in the running for the coolest name for a blog, which is Papers Falling from an Attic Window, which I just absolutely love, which is danharms.wordpress.com. But can you tell us a little bit about your blogs, your books? Definitely, listeners, check out the video and podcast descriptions below. But anywhere else, Dan, that people can check out your work, that they can reach out to you, or that they can support you?
Due to my frustration with the WordPress interface, I've moved over to Medium as a platform, but that's okay because the URL you just gave will, at the very first post, it'll give you a link to the Medium, and that will allow people to sign up for email alerts from me. I can promise you that I will post irregularly, so I won't flood you with information, but it's there that I talk a little bit about what my work is. Also, I try to review new grimoires as they come out, which has become more and more of a chore recently, though, of course, it's great that we're in this sort of grimoire renaissance and able to get all these cool books. It's just like if you decide you're going to start reviewing it, it's going to take a while sometimes, especially when there's some huge tomes. So that's probably the best place to catch me. I try to post, where I'm going to appear, if there's going to be some sort of conference or something like that, and sometimes you'll just get random notes about role-playing games, but that's kind of just the danger of, reading my blog.
And listeners, check out the links below to Dan's blog at medium.com, because the August 6th post, just to give you a sense if you haven't been there before, is new and forthcoming books, thoughts on my career, Ars Notoria argument, Abramelin and the Venetian Inquisition, Yoda fights Jesus. So definitely a menagerie of excellent topics that I know you listeners will enjoy for sure. Dan Harms, scholar, author, researcher, illuminator, elucidator of witch bottles and exploring just this fascinating history. His latest book is Witch Bottles: History, Culture, Magic. Dan Harms, thank you just so much for stopping on the Glitch Bottle podcast today. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. It's always great to be here.
Listeners and Glitch Bottle patrons, I hope you enjoyed that chat with Dan Harms as much as I did. Dan, as usual, is just so fascinating because he brings together these different tributaries, historical records, witch trial records, different accounts, different manuscripts, the physical specimens, also discussing laboratory testing and science. I mean, one thing that Dan does so well, among many other things to me, is he informs with the history and the context, but he also shares how the story of fully understanding witch bottles is far from over. So check out the podcast and video descriptions below to get your own copy of Dan's book, Witch Bottles. And again, a huge thanks to each and every Glitch Bottle podcast supporter on patreon.com/glitchbottle. If you would like exclusive perks and you're willing to put up with an inordinate amount of nerdiness, please consider becoming a member, a podcast supporter, because you, the patrons, are the number one reason, the only reason why the podcast continues to grow in new and interesting ways. As always, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, but not witch bottles, and keep the light.